Welcome back, everyone.
Good to be here.
So today we're doing a really deep dive into how Mexico City essentially rose from the ashes of Tenochtitlan.
Yeah, it's quite a story. A powerful indigenous capital transformed violently into the heart of Spanish colonial power.
And we're talking about a city, Tenochtitlan, founded way back, maybe around 1325. Then, boom, 1521 hits.
A complete pivot point.
Okay, let's unpack this because it's not just about building over something. It's about how that foundation, the old city, shaped the new one for, 3 centuries?
Exactly. The sources we're looking at really highlight that drama, that rapid shift, and just why Mexico City became, the absolute cradle of Spanish rule in the Americas.
So the conquest itself, 1521, Hernan Cortez, you're saying the choice of location was deliberate, symbolic.
Oh, absolutely deliberate. It was a calculated political move. By building right on the ruins of the Aztec capital, the Spanish were making a massive statement.
Like planting a flag, but with buildings.
Precisely. They were claiming the existing authority, the established center of power. This wasn't just a city. It was meant to be the nerve center for all of New Spain, and really for a huge chunk of their American empire.
Okay.
So our mission today really is to look at the evidence, the sources, and see how Mexico City managed this kind of double act.
Erasing and preserving at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. Symbolically erasing the past, but physically relying on some crucial bits of it. And for you listening, we want to explore how the decisions made back then, architectural, political, economic, really set the stage for the entire colonial period.
Let's start with the physical destruction then. 1521, our sources are pretty clear. Tenochtitlan wasn't just conquered, it was...
It was besieged and then systematically razed.
Razed. That's a strong word.
It implies deliberate, thorough destruction. They wanted to dismantle the centers of indigenous power, physically remove them.
But wasn't there some initial awe? I remember reading accounts like from Bernal Diaz del Castillo.
Oh, absolutely. Initial descriptions are full of wonder. The causeways, the markets, the scale of Tenochtitlan. It was unlike anything they'd seen.
So wonder first, then destruction.
Yes. That initial awe quickly gave way to the political need to dominate, to impose their own order.
Which brings us to this fascinating point you raised, building the new on the old. How literally are we talking?
Very literally. And this is the crucial nugget. They didn't just clear the site and bring in new materials. They actively used the rubble of the old city.
So, recycling the defeat.
In a way, yes. The most powerful example is the Templo Mayor, the main Aztec temple complex, sacred ground.
Right.
The stones from the Rentayas Templo Mayor were used to build the foundations and walls of the new Metropolitan Cathedral and the Viceroy's Palace, right there in the central plaza, the Zocalo.
Wow. That is incredibly potent symbolism.
It's hard to overstate. You're embedding the victory into the very fabric of the new structures, using the holiest site of the vanquished religion to build the symbols of the new order, the church and the state. It's a constant physical reminder of the conquest.
Okay, so that's the symbolic erasure part. But you also mentioned they kept elements of the original city plan. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it boils down to necessity, really. And this is where the sources give us that deeper insight.
Necessity? How?
Well, remember, Tenochtitlan was built on a lake. It was an incredible feat of engineering, with causeways, canals, dikes, a whole system to manage water in a challenging environment.
Okay, yeah, the floating city, almost.
Sort of, yeah. If the Spanish had just ignored all that existing infrastructure and tried to impose a completely new grid, the place would have been a disaster. Constant flooding, instability.
Ah, right. So they were kind of stuck with it.
Pretty much. They had to retain the main Aztec causeways, which became major streets. They had to work with the existing water management systems, the aqueducts. So beneath the Spanish colonial facade, the actual street layout, the fundamental structure keeping the city viable.
That was Aztec.
Largely, yes. It's this fascinating physical layer of continuity. They imposed their power symbolically, but they were fundamentally dependent on the engineering genius of the civilization they had just overthrown, just to, keep the city standing.
That's incredible. So the physical city is established a mix of destruction and dependence. How did they then cement political control? The sources say it became the absolute center.
Instantly. It had to be. Mexico City became the political, the religious, the economic, the cultural capital of the entire viceroyalty of New Spain. Everything radiated outwards from here.
And that meant institutions, right? Bureaucracy.
Exactly. A whole colonial apparatus was set up. If you were anyone important in the Spanish system, you were based in Mexico City. The top elites lived there. It was the seat of all the key administrative bodies.
Like the town council, The Cabildo.
Right. The Cabildo was vital for local governance, managing daily life, infrastructure projects, land ownership disputes, things like that.
So local power.
Local power, yes, but always under the eye of the viceroy, who was the king's personal representative. The viceroy's palace was right there on the main square, a constant symbol of royal authority. The archbishopric was there too, overseeing the church's massive influence.
You mentioned the Cabildo answering to the viceroy. Was there friction there?
Oh, absolutely. That's a key point in the sources. The Cabildo was often dominated by wealthy Criollo Spaniards born in the Americas whose local interests didn't always align perfectly with the crown's directives coming through the viceroy, who was usually a peninsular, someone born in Spain.
Ah, okay. So that's an early tension.
A very early and persistent tension. It laid the groundwork for conflicts down the line.
So administration is set up, but for long-term control, you need more than just bureaucrats. You mentioned education.
Yes, and this is where the Spanish moved incredibly fast, which tells you something about their priorities. They needed to control the narrative, shape the minds of the next generation of administrators and clergy.
So the university.
The Royal and Pontifical University of Mexico, founded in 1553.
1553. That's only, 32 years after the conquest?
Exactly. It's remarkably early, establishing a major university that quickly shows a very deliberate strategy.
To do what? Just train people?
To train them? Yes. But also to solidify Catholic doctrine, promote Spanish language and law, and basically create an intellectual center that would legitimize Spanish rule and ensure a supply of loyal, trained personnel for the colonial project. It made Mexico City not just the political capital, but the undisputed intellectual and religious capital too.
Okay, that makes sense. Political power, intellectual control. But empires need money. Let's shift gears a bit. How did the economy of colonial Mexico City work? You mentioned it was the hub.
The economic hub, no question. Especially when it came to the single most important commodity for the Spanish Empire.
Silver.
Silver, absolutely. Mexico City wasn't where the silver was mined that was happening further out, places like Zacatecas, Guanajuato.
Yeah?
But the city was where the wealth converged.
How?
It was the administrative and financial center. The silver flowed into Mexico City to be accounted for, taxed by the crown, often minted into coins at the Casa de Moneda, the mint, and then prepared for shipment.
Shipment where? Back to Spain?
A lot of it, yes. The famous treasure fleets. But also, and this is where it gets really interesting and global, shipment across the Pacific.
Ah, the Manila galleons.
Exactly. Mexico City, through its port connection at Acapulco, was the crucial link in this vast trade network.
Sure.
Silver went west to Manila in the Philippines.
And what came back?
Asian luxury goods, silks, porcelain, spices, things that were in high demand in the Americas and Europe. Those goods came back to Acapulco, traveled overland to Mexico City, and were then distributed or sent on across the Atlantic.
So the city was like this giant wealthy funnel.
A global crossroads, really. Funded by silver, it housed the great merchant houses, the powerful families and companies that controlled this intercontinental trade. That immense wealth is reflected in the opulent colonial architecture you can still see.
And all that wealth, all that activity, it must have created a complex society. The sources talk about diversity, but also hierarchy.
Extremely hierarchical.
Yeah.
And that created social dynamics that defined the entire colonial era. It was diverse, yes, but rigidly structured.
Can you break down those layers for us?
Sure. At the very top, you had the peninsulares.
Those are the ones born in Spain.
Correct. They held almost exclusively the highest positions. Viceroy, archbishop, top judges, military commanders. They were the direct representatives of Spanish authority.
Okay, and below them?
Below them were the Criollos, or Creoles. These were people of pure Spanish descent, but born in the Americas.
So ethnically Spanish, often wealthy, educated.
Absolutely. Many Criollo families owned vast estates, mines, businesses. They considered themselves loyal subjects of the king, but
they were shut out of the top jobs.
Pretty much. There was a systemic bias favoring the peninsulares for the highest offices, and this is a major source of resentment.
I can imagine. They see themselves as Spanish, they're running the local economy often, but they can't reach the absolute peak of power.
Exactly. They saw it as unfair, an insult. This peninsular Criollo tension became arguably the single most important fault line within the colonial elite. It simmered for generations and was a key factor leading to the independence movements later on.
Okay, so that's the Spanish layer, divided. What about other groups? The sources mention mixed race populations.
Yes, the castas. Colonial society developed this incredibly complex system for categorizing people of mixed ancestry: Spanish, indigenous, African, mestizos, mulattoes, zombos, and dozens of other classifications, each with perceived social standings and often legal restrictions.
A whole vocabulary of hierarchy.
A very elaborate one. And then, of course, you had the indigenous peoples themselves.
Who weren't just out in the countryside, right? They were in the city, too.
Definitely. This is crucial. Despite the conquest and the Spanish dominance, indigenous communities didn't just vanish from the urban landscape. They persisted.
How? What did that look like?
Well, elements of the pre-Hispanic urban organization sometimes continued. Indigenous people often lived in specific neighborhoods, the barrios, sometimes based on older Calpulli structures. They had their own social dynamics, sometimes their own local leaders recognized by the Spanish for administrative purposes, like tax collection or labor organization.
So not complete erasure, even socially.
Not at all, and culturally too. While Spanish was the language of power, indigenous languages, especially Nahuatl in the Valley of Mexico, remained widely spoken. You'd hear it in the markets, in homes. Indigenous foods, weaving techniques, agricultural practices, they all continued and blended with Spanish ways.
So the city wasn't this monolithic Spanish space. It was mixed.
It was a constant interaction, a hybridization, sometimes cooperative, often exploitative, sometimes involving subtle forms of resistance. But indigenous culture wasn't wiped out. It adapted and endured within the colonial structure. That complexity, that constant negotiation between dominance and persistence really defined Mexico City for those 300 years.
It sounds like a place of incredible tension, but also dynamism, built right on top of a vanished world, but never fully escaping it.
That's a great way to put it. Mexico City perfectly embodied Spanish imperial goals, a center of power, faith, wealth. But its very foundation, physically and demographically, tied it irrevocably to the indigenous past. It couldn't escape that history.
And looking at the bigger picture from our sources, the city's role over those 3 centuries wasn't just local. It shaped New Spain, shaped the wider Spanish Empire.
Absolutely. Its administrative model, its cultural influence, its economic function, they set the pattern for much of Spanish colonization in the Americas. It was the template, right up until Mexico finally achieved independence in 1821.
Which leaves us with a final thought, something for you, our listeners, to chew on.
Yeah, think about those 2 dates we started with. Tenochtitlan, founded around 1325. Mexico City, the Spanish capital, established 1521. 2 beginnings, 1 place.
So the question is, how does that foundational act, building a new capital by destroying the old one, right on its ruins, how does that shape a city's identity centuries later, even after the colonizers are gone?
Right. When people think of Mexico City today, what feels more defining? That deep indigenous origin from 1325, the 3 centuries as the heart of a vast colonial empire starting in 1521? Or is it the enduring tension, the mix, the legacy of both existing together? Yep. Something to consider. You know, if you look at the Mexican flag today, it's really quite striking. That image, the eagle on a cactus, maybe holding a snake. It's powerful, visually stunning, but it's more than just a symbol. It's basically the origin story of an entire empire distilled. That specific vision, the eagle, the cactus, the snake, that comes from an ancient prophecy. It guided the Mexican people, who most of us know as the Aztecs, to settle in what seems like the worst possible place, a small, swampy, low-lying island right in the middle of Lake Texcoco, and somehow they took that marsh and turned it into Tenochtitlan, the absolute center of power, economy, religion, everything in central Mexico back then. We got some fantastic material from you, really tracing how this transformation happened. So our mission today is to do a deep dive into that, the engineering, the politics, frankly, the sheer audacity it took, building one of the world's biggest, most complex cities, basically on water. We're talking about the capital of the Mexican civilization, just defying its environment to become this dominant force. Stability, food for hundreds of thousands, administration, all from an island. Okay, let's unpack this. How do you build an empire on water and make it last?
Well, you really have to start with that founding moment, around 1325, because the conditions they walked into were frankly terrible. They were pushed to the margins, looking for a place to settle, and they end up on this tiny, unstable island in Lake Texcoco, in the Valley of Mexico.
Not exactly prime real estate.
Not at all. Really difficult. But the prophecy, that specific vision, said this was the place. And that story becomes the ideological foundation. It justifies the immense effort, the generations of work that were needed.
So it wasn't just a myth. It was a core belief that drove them to overcome those obstacles.
Precisely. Think about it. Any other group might look for high ground, fertile land nearby. The Mexica chose a spot where stability was a daily struggle, but maybe that constant challenge forced a kind of cooperation, an organizational level.
That others didn't need right away.
Exactly. They had to be organized from day one just to make it work.
And the water itself, reading through the materials, I was struck by the salt content. Lake Texcoco, especially where they settled, was quite brackish, wasn't it?
That's a critical point. Salinity was a huge hurdle. You can't drink salty water, and it makes farming incredibly difficult.
So how did they solve that fundamental problem? Fresh water.
That's where some of the real genius starts to show. It wasn't immediate, but eventually they undertook massive engineering projects. Huge earthen dikes, miles long in some cases. They essentially built barriers to separate the salty western part of the lake.
Where the city was.
Right, from the eastern parts of the lake system that were fed by freshwater springs and rivers.
So they were effectively creating their own freshwater zone around the city, like damming sections of the lake.
You've got it. It shows the sophisticated understanding of hydrology. They manipulated the lake system itself.
Okay, so they get fresh water.
Yeah.
But the island is still small and swampy. How do you feed what became a massive population? I mean, estimates go up to 200,000 people, maybe more. Larger than London or Paris at the time.
That's the next big challenge. No real arable land on the island itself.
Which brings us to that moment you mentioned in the sources, the chinampas.
The chinampas, yes. These so-called floating gardens. A brilliant solution born entirely from constraint.
Were they actually floating, though?
Not really, no. That's a bit of a misconception. They were more like artificial islands or raised fields built right into the shallow lake bed.
How do they make them?
They'd mark out rectangular areas in the shallows, fence them with reeds or posts, and then layer materials inside. Rich mud dredged from the lake bottom lodo, they called it decaying plants, sediment, building it up above the water level.
And the advantage was?
Constant irrigation. Water seeped up from the lake, keeping the soil moist. Plus, the decaying organic matter acted like a built-in fertilizer. They were incredibly fertile, self-sustaining plots.
Which meant more food.
Way more food. The sources talk about potentially up to 7 harvests a year under ideal conditions.
7, compared to maybe 2 on typical dry land nearby.
Exactly. It guaranteed food security. They essentially manufactured agricultural abundance right there in the lake.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. They didn't just survive on the island. They mastered it. The planning, the infrastructure to support all this.
Absolutely crucial. You can't have a city that large without meticulous planning. Especially on an island. They focused on 2 things, connection to the outside and movement within the city.
So the causeways we talked about earlier weren't just dams.
No, there were much more. There were wide, raised roads connecting the island city to the mainland shores, vital arteries for trade, for troop movement, and for controlling access. They even had fortifications built in.
Multi-lane highways, essentially, across the water.
Pretty much. But inside the city, movement was different. Lots of canals.
Like Venice, but maybe more planned.
In a way, yes. Tenochtitlan was laid out on a kind of grid. Major canals served as main thoroughfares for canoe traffic. Goods, people, everything moved on the water internally.
But that raises questions. What about flooding and sanitation in such a dense place surrounded by water?
Good questions. They managed the water levels carefully, with sluices and dikes. For sanitation, they were surprisingly organized. There were, believe it or not, dedicated boats for collecting refuse and human waste.
Really? What did they do with it?
Recycled it. That waste became valuable fertilizer for the chinampas. Closing the loop in a way.
Okay, that's clever. And drinking water.
Yeah.
Was it separate from the canals people were paddling through?
Yes, very important. They built stone aqueducts, bringing fresh spring water directly from the mainland into the city center for drinking and cooking. Kept it separate from the transportation canals.
Wow, so the water was everything, their farms, their roads, their defense, but also their biggest management challenge.
Constantly. Required non-stop maintenance, engineering oversight, but that combination, the incredibly productive chinampas and the organized canal system, it created a stable base.
A base from which they could stop just surviving and start, well, empire building.
Exactly. Once the basic needs were met, and met abundantly, they could turn their focus outward. Their early history involved being, let's say, effective mercenaries for stronger neighbors. But the real shift, the leap to dominance, came later.
With the Triple Alliance. Around 1428, the sources say.
That's the key date. Around 1428, Tenochtitlan formed an alliance with two other powerful city-states in the valley, Texcoco and Tlacopan.
And reading about it, this wasn't exactly a partnership of equals, was it? Tenochtitlan seemed to be the senior partner from early on.
Very much so. Tenochtitlan brought the military might, the aggressive expansionist drive. Texcoco was renowned for its legal scholars, its engineers. They likely contributed heavily to some of those big water management projects we discussed.
Okay. And Tlacopan.
Tlacopan was the junior partner, smaller but strategically necessary. They often helped manage the tribute collection from conquered territories.
So this alliance gave them collective power far beyond any single city.
Exponentially more. It allowed the Mexica, led by Tenochtitlan, to rapidly expand their control over vast swaths of central Mexico. They established a very efficient system for demanding tribute goods, food, luxury items, labor from subject people.
And Tenochtitlan became the hub where all this flowed, the administrative center.
Absolutely. It was the seat of the emperor, the Tlatoani. It was where the tribute was tallied, stored, redistributed, where major political decisions were made, where religious ceremonies centered the empire.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that sheer logistical operation, managing tribute from so many different places, that must have required a huge bureaucracy.
It cemented Tenochtitlan's role. It wasn't just the biggest city or the holiest site. It was the functioning nerve center of the empire.
And you could see that power reflected in the city itself, the monumental buildings. We should mention the Temple Mayor.
Definitely. The Great Temple, right at the heart of the sacred precinct. It wasn't just impressive, it symbolized the entire imperial project.
How so?
It was actually a twin pyramid. One side dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war representing their military expansion. The other side dedicated to Tlaloc, the god of rain and agriculture representing the Chinampa-based abundance that fueled it all.
War and water.
The foundations of their power. And crucially, the Temple Mayor wasn't built just once. It was rebuilt and expanded repeatedly, maybe 7 major phases, each new layer encasing the old one.
Like layers of an onion. Why do that?
It physically demonstrated growth, continuity, increasing power. Each emperor added to it. It was a tangible symbol to everyone, subjects, visitors, rivals of the empire's strength and stability. It showed their command over immense labor and resources.
It's just incredible when you think about the timeline. They show up at this swampy island around 1325, guided by prophecy. They figure out the water, the food, with amazing engineering. Then, just over a century later, 1428, they form the alliance that lets them explode outwards and build this massive empire, all run from that same island city. So what does this all mean? You end up with a civilization that didn't just adapt to its environment, it actively reshaped it, bent it to its will, really, to fulfill what they saw as their destiny, and create one of the world's great urban centers, right up until the Spanish arrived in 1521 and everything changed.
Exactly. And that brings us to maybe a final thought, something for you to mull over. When you consider that whole arc from finding that island to running a vast tribute empire in less than 200 years, it really makes you think about their administrative capacity. Consider the sheer scale. Managing potentially 7 harvests a year from thousands of chinampas, maintaining miles of dikes and aqueducts, organizing the collection and transport of tribute feathers, jade, textiles, food from hundreds of towns, some quite distant, all coordinated from an island connected only by those causeways. What level of, let's say, centralized planning, record-keeping, specialized labor, and just sheer social cooperation does that imply? It suggests an administrative machine far more sophisticated than maybe they're sometimes given credit for, especially before the conquest. It wasn't just about military power. That complexity, built quite literally on water. It's really something to contemplate. Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at a period often seen just through that lens of military conquest, the fall of the Aztec Empire. But we want to go deeper, beyond Hernan Cortés the Conqueror. Our mission today is to really understand him as the architect of colonial Mexico City.
It's a really vital reframing, I think. We're drilling down into the sources about that foundational period, right after Tenochtitlan's capture in 1521.
Right.
And it was such a short window, remarkably short, where Cortés didn't just win a war. He kicked off this deliberate, very comprehensive effort to engineer a complete political, social, and urban transformation.
And the result of that effort, what he actually built, it wasn't just some new city. It was more like a template, wasn't it?
Exactly, a blueprint.
You really can't grasp the next 300 years of Spanish colonial rule in the Americas without sort of dissecting the plan Cortez laid down in just those first few years.
They were incredibly decisive actions.
Foundational. Okay, so let's unpack that immediate aftermath. August 1521, Tenochtitlan falls after a brutal siege. The city is, devastated.
Utterly. Rubble and ruin.
You'd think Cortez would just, plant his flag and start rebuilding right there on the ruins. Consolidate. But the sources point to something else first. A surprising little detour. Where did he actually settle initially? Set up his Spanish town council?
Yeah, it's interesting. He actually went to nearby Coyoacan first. Temporarily set up his administration there.
Coyoacan? Why there?
Well, it was pragmatic, really. Tenochtitlan, the island city, was still reeling. The logistics of trying to govern from that rubble-strewn island immediately were just immense.
Yeah.
Astronomical.
Okay.
So Coyoacan offered a necessary staging ground. It was safer, it was drier, and crucially, it was administratively functional almost immediately.
Right, so he had a perfectly viable alternative right there. A place he could have established a permanent new capital without the massive headache of rebuilding on a wrecked lake bed.
He did.
So why? Why make that pivotal strategic choice to effectively abandon Coyoacan and go back to the ruins on the island?
Because that specific location, the heart of the old Aztec Empire, it was just symbolically irreplaceable.
Yeah.
He understood that power, that legitimacy, is deeply tied to place. So by choosing to rebuild the new Spanish colonial capital directly on the original island site, Lake Texcoco, despite all the destruction, he was making this undeniable statement.
The statement of what, exactly?
Well, it was heavy with symbolic weight, wasn't it? It symbolized total conquest, obviously the new power, literally rising from the ashes of the old.
Yeah.
But crucially, it also ensured a kind of continuity. By inheriting that exact geographic spot, the new Spanish capital, Mexico City, it instantly absorbed the prestige, the centrality, the established strategic importance of the old Aztec center.
So it was like taking over the existing brand recognition, in a way.
Kind of, yes. A calculated risk to assume inherited dominance immediately.
That makes perfect sense. You claim the former center of gravity to consolidate your own power. Okay, so this brings us to the physical transformation, the architectural erasure you mentioned. To really establish a new order, you can't just put up flags, right? You need to physically remove the old symbols. What did Cortez immediately order to, clear the stage?
The first and most critical action was just massive destruction, especially the Aztec temples and their monumental structures. The Templo Mayor, above all.
The main temple complex.
Exactly. The spiritual and governmental heart of the old city. This was a very deliberate act of physical and religious erasure. The goal was clear. Remove any visible representation of the old empire's power, its sovereignty, its gods.
And then they used the materials, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Think about the symbolic violence involved there. The sources are pretty clear that the Spanish leadership quickly started using the stones, the rubble, even the foundations of the demolished Aztec buildings.
To build their own structures.
To build the new Spanish ones. Churches, government buildings. It's this visceral demonstration of replacement. Literally turning the physical remnants of the old gods into the foundations for the new church and state.
Wow. And what grew out of that rubble wasn't just haphazard, was it? Cortez directed the rebuilding based on Spanish architectural styles, Spanish urban planning, that rigid grid layout. Why was that so important?
Because the grid, the traza, it isn't just about looking neat and European. It's fundamentally an engine of control.
So?
Well, first, it imposed immediate order and familiarity for the new Spanish residents. But much more importantly for the administration, it standardized everything. Property lines, street access.
Makes sense.
A uniform grid makes governance, tax collection, land allotment, population monitoring, all of it far simpler and more efficient than trying to manage the sort of organic complexity of the old indigenous city layout.
But here's where it gets really interesting, for me anyway, because the sources say the planning wasn't like 100% replacement. They laid out the main streets and blocks in the Spanish grid, yes, but they've preserved some of the original Aztec roadways. That feels counterintuitive if you're going for total erasure.
It does, but that's the pragmatic brilliance, maybe, embedded within the arrogance of conquest. They kept those main Aztec causeways, the ones leading onto the island across the lake, because they were essential infrastructure. They were proven, efficient arteries for moving people, goods, troops in that unique lake environment. Why reinvent the wheel when the existing one works perfectly?
So integrate what works.
Exactly. They integrated the indigenous infrastructure that served their purposes into their new European design. So the result, the physical restructuring, it created a city that was undeniably a Spanish colonial hub, but one that was also strategically located and partially functional, thanks to that pre-existing Aztec engineering.
It's fascinating how quickly that focus shifts, isn't it? From stone and mortar to politics and society. Okay, let's shift gears then to the political blueprints. We've got the physical city taking shape. Who's running the show?
Right.
Between 1521 and 1524, Cortés is acting as Captain General, governor, basically the top authority in the new colony. What were his immediate priorities for actually establishing stable rule, beyond just building walls?
Well, his first priority had to be creating bureaucracy, almost instantly. Stability depended on formalizing Spanish authority. So he had to manage the administration, appoint the first Spanish officials, treasurers, judges, clerks.
Setting up the government machine?
Precisely. Creating a functioning colonial government that could start processing tribute, managing disputes, distributing assets, rewards. This was about the rapid imposition of Spanish law over indigenous custom.
And this wasn't just contained to Mexico City itself, right? He looked beyond the capital.
Oh, absolutely critical. His actions went far beyond the city limits very quickly. To solidify Spanish rule across the territory, to prevent coordinated rebellions, he began founding other key Spanish cities. Places like Veracruz on the coast, Oaxaca further south.
Spreading the network.
Yes. This was essential for extending Spanish control throughout what they were now calling New Spain. He wasn't just building a capital, he was consciously building an interconnected network of colonial power, securing communication routes, resource flows, all funneling back towards Mexico City.
Okay, so founding cities creates the administrative network. But what about controlling the people, the economy? This brings us to that infamous system he imposed, the long-term structural foundation for exploitation, the encomienda system.
Yes, encomienda.
For listeners who might not know the specifics, how did Cortés implement this, and what was its core function, really?
The encomienda system was essentially the economic and social scaffolding of early New Spain. Crucially, it didn't grant Spanish settlers outright ownership of land, not initially anyway.
Okay, not land.
Yeah.
What then?
It granted them the right to collect tribute in goods or labor from a specific number of indigenous people living in a particular area. The grant was over the people.
So control over the people, their work, what they produced, but not technically the soil itself at first?
Exactly. That's the key distinction early on.
Yeah.
It effectively legalized the transfer of indigenous labor and resources directly into the hands of the Spanish encomenderos, the holders of the grants.
And Cortés used this.
He used this system strategically to reward his soldiers, his key lieutenants, important settlers, cementing their loyalty to him and to the colonial project. But at the same time, it forced the indigenous population into this very structured economic subservience. It was the absolute crucial structural element that funded the entire colonial endeavor in those early decades.
And this is all happening alongside the imposition of Spanish law, the building projects, and the religious aspect too, the push for Christian conversion.
Absolutely. They were happening in parallel, reinforcing each other. The conversion effort, led initially by Franciscan and Dominican friars arriving soon after the conquest, provided a sort of moral and social justification for colonial rule.
How so?
Well, the argument was that the encomenderos had a duty, a responsibility, to oversee the spiritual well-being and conversion of the indigenous people assigned to them, even as they were exploiting their labor.
Right, a justification.
A justification, yes.
Right.
So you have this immediate, incredibly comprehensive foundation being laid between 1521 and 1524, structurally, politically, economically, and religiously. It firmly established Mexico City not just as a capital, but as the undisputed cradle of Spanish colonial rule in North America.
It really was this multi-pronged strategy executed almost simultaneously. So Cortés wasn't just a military leader who happened to win. He was the primary conscious architect of this sweeping urban, socioeconomic, and political transformation. He didn't just defeat the old system, he actively designed and built its replacement.
And I think, what this really means for how we understand conquest. It reinforces that effective, lasting conquest is about far more than just military victory on the battlefield. It requires the immediate and quite detailed imposition of a new administrative structure, what you could call the political architecture, right onto the geographic heart of the old power. You seize and transform the capital, both physically and institutionally, and you fundamentally redirect the destiny of the entire region.
It's a powerful lesson in state building or perhaps state replacement, and yet there's still that curious detail we mentioned about Cortés preserving some of those original Aztec roadways for efficiency's sake.
The practical side.
It just makes you wonder, doesn't it? Despite that massive effort to erase and replace, how much of a conquered city's original strategic or structural foundation can truly be erased? And how much does that pre-existing efficient infrastructure, the bones of the place, continue to dictate its future regardless of who happens to be in charge?
That's a fascinating question. How much does the ghost of the old city live on in the new?
Something for you to mull over, perhaps, as you navigate your own built environment today.